Richard Carter arrived at his sprawling estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, on a Wednesday afternoon without notifying a single member of his staff. It was entirely against his nature to arrive unannounced, as his strict routine usually dictated a Friday evening return when everything was arranged, exactly to his demanding specifications. However, an important merger meeting in the city had been cancelled with 3 hours of notice, and the next available private flight was at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Richard was not the type of wealthy businessman who waited around in airport lounges when he had the immediate option to leave. He walked through the massive front doors with his leather briefcase in hand, his mind still thoroughly occupied by the complex legal contract he had not quite finished reviewing during his flight. Suddenly, he stopped in the grand foyer, not because of anything specific he could see, but because of a distinct atmosphere he absolutely did not expect to feel. The massive house smelled completely different, lacking the neutral, sterile, and heavily controlled scent of the advanced climate systems that his estate manager deemed optimal for preserving the imported furniture. There was something remarkably distinct lingering in the air, a delicate fragrance of fresh flowers that caught his attention immediately. These were not the standard decorative arrangements that the high-end florists delivered and swapped out every single week, according to strict house protocol, but simple, vibrant flowers placed deliberately nearby because someone genuinely wanted them to be appreciated. There was also something much harder to define, something Richard took several long moments to properly identify because he had gone such a long time without ever encountering it inside those cold walls. It was a deeply human presence, a subtle warmth that permeated the corridor and made the grandiose mansion feel strangely lived in. He slowly set his heavy briefcase down on the marble entryway table and began walking quietly toward the east wing where his mother's master bedroom was located. Eleanor Carter had been living with her devastating diagnosis of advanced stage cancer for exactly 8 agonizing months. Richard had spared absolutely no expense, paying out of pocket for the absolute best oncologists in the entire country, the most comprehensive and aggressive treatments available, 2 private nurses for every single shift, and a dedicated medical administrator who meticulously coordinated every single aspect of her daily care. Everything was completely financially covered, every medical bill paid before it was even printed, and Richard diligently reviewed the clinical reports every single week, from whatever distant corporate office he happened to occupy. He sincerely believed he was fulfilling his ultimate duty as a loyal son, providing a fortress of medical security that few people could ever dream of affording. That was the comforting narrative he constantly repeated to himself whenever the haunting thought of his ailing mother surfaced in the brief, quiet spaces between his relentless corporate meetings. The heavy oak door to Eleanor's bedroom was left slightly ajar, casting a thin sliver of warm light across the darkened hallway. He approached without making a single sound, not out of any malicious intention to spy on the medical staff, but simply because his leather shoes on the imported marble floor were naturally silent and absolutely no one had heard him enter the estate. He leaned forward and quietly peeked inside the room, completely unprepared for the emotional weight of the scene unfolding before him. What he witnessed instantly paralyzed him, freezing him completely in place as he tried to process the profound intimacy of the quiet moment. His mother was sitting weakly in the plush armchair beside the large bay window, her eyes gently closed, and her frail head tilted slightly forward in a posture of complete surrender. Kneeling directly on the floor front of her was a young woman whom Richard utterly failed to recognize from his brief, analytical reviews of the domestic staff files. She had dark hair pulled back into a simple, unpretentious bun, wore standard, unassuming work clothes, and her hands moved with a tender delicacy that completely lacked the sterile, mechanical precision of a formally trained medical professional. Her movements were driven by a genuine, profound care, radiating the unmistakable warmth of someone performing a difficult task, because the person sitting right in front of her truly mattered to her heart. The young woman was carefully shaving his mother's head, gently guiding the humming clipper over the scalp. The very last stubborn strands of silver hair that had miraculously survived the brutal rounds of chemotherapy were now falling slowly and silently to the floor. Richard carefully studied the young woman's face and was shocked to realize that she was crying in absolute silence. It was not the loud, ostentatious weeping of someone who desperately wanted their grief to be witnessed and validated by others, but the quiet, devastating sorrow of a person feeling an emotion so profound they could neither contain it nor allow it to become a disruptive scene. And his mother, Eleanor, who for the past several months had worn a constant expression that Richard strictly associated with the grim resignation of someone accepting permanent agony, now had her eyes softly closed with an aura of absolute peace radiating from her tired face. She was gently holding the young woman's slender wrist with her frail hand, not as a restraint to keep her from pulling away, but as a tender reassurance. She was holding her in the exact way someone holds another soul, so they both know, without a single spoken word, that they are supporting one another through the darkest of times. Richard did not push the door open, nor did he utter a single syllable to interrupt the sacred quietness of the room. He stood frozen in the wooden doorframe for a span of time he could not possibly measure, silently observing a raw emotional exchange he had absolutely no idea how to properly articulate. The scene produced a heavy, sinking sensation in the very center of his chest, an ache he failed to categorize because it was vastly more uncomfortable and confronting than simple tenderness. It was the crushing realization that what he was witnessing was a pure comfort he had completely failed to provide, and that all the millions of dollars he had spent organizing her care from a safe distance had never produced a single moment like this. In that sunlit room surrounded by cheap fresh flowers, the scent of ginger tea, and the gentle hands of a total stranger, his mother possessed a quiet grace that his lucrative corporate contracts could never hope to purchase. He slowly backed away from the door, retreating quietly down the long corridor until he reached the sterile isolation of his expansive home office. He collapsed into the leather chair behind his massive oak desk and reflexively opened his silver laptop, driven by the automatic, desperate need to engage in a concrete task when his internal emotions lacked any concrete shape. However, he did not read a single word of the complex financial documents illuminating the bright screen. He simply sat there staring blankly, his mind endlessly replaying the vivid image of his ailing mother and the weeping young woman, specifically fixating on Eleanor's frail hand resting so tenderly over that small wrist. He dug deep into his memory, frantically trying to remember the very last time he had genuinely sat down and held his own mother's hand without glancing at his expensive watch. He could not remember, and the terrifying realization that he could not remember became the heaviest burden he had ever carried. The following morning, precisely at 8 o'clock, Richard picked up his office telephone and firmly called his estate administrator, Mrs. Parker. He demanded she immediately bring him the comprehensive personnel files and access logs for the entire domestic staff employed at the Greenwich estate. Mrs. Parker produced the thick folder within exactly 20 minutes, moving with the anxious efficiency of a seasoned professional who perfectly anticipates that when the boss uses that specific clipped tone, any delay is absolutely unacceptable. She stood nervously beside the heavy desk as Richard flipped through the pages, quickly explaining the various names, the rotating shifts, and the specific daily responsibilities assigned to each hired worker. When his finger stopped sharply on the name Valerie Cross, Richard raised his hand to stop the administrator's frantic rambling. He looked up with cold, calculating eyes and asked exactly what duties that specific 26-year-old employee was contracted to perform. Mrs. Parker swallowed hard, explaining that Valerie was strictly hired for general household cleaning, specifically maintaining the common areas, the second-floor guest rooms, and coordinating the massive loads of laundry. Richard scanned the employment date, noting she had been officially hired a mere 6 months ago, and immediately instructed Mrs. Parker to summon the young woman to his office at exactly 10 o'clock. Valerie arrived precisely on time, standing in the doorway with the remarkably steady posture of someone who acutely understands they have been called in for a highly difficult conversation, yet has firmly decided beforehand they will not cower or shrink under pressure. Richard stared at her intently from behind his imposing mahogany desk, silently gesturing for her to take the leather seat opposite him. She sat down smoothly, keeping her dark eyes locked firmly onto his, waiting patiently for the inevitable interrogation to begin. Richard leaned forward, clasping his hands together, and coldly informed her that he had observed exactly what she was doing in his mother's private bedroom the previous afternoon. Valerie did not respond immediately. She offered no frantic apologies, displayed absolutely zero nervous guilt, and maintained the incredible calm of someone waiting to hear the complete accusation before deciding how to properly formulate her defense. Richard sternly reminded her that she had been hired exclusively to scrub floors and manage the estate's laundry, not to act as a personal caregiver or assume highly sensitive medical responsibilities that strictly belonged to the highly paid, certified nursing staff. Valerie nodded slowly, stating clearly that she perfectly understood his words and his authoritative position. However, she respectfully yet firmly requested his permission to explain exactly what she'd had personally witnessed happening in that massive, lonely house over the past several months. Richard offered no verbal response, which Valerie astutely interpreted as a silent permission to speak her mind freely. She explained, her voice steady and unyielding, that Eleanor had spent 3 agonizing nights soaked in feverish sweat, without a single person bothering to change her damp bedsheets. Valerie vividly recounted how, on one particularly terrible night, Eleanor had become violently ill, and Valerie had desperately called the assigned private nurse 4 separate times before anyone finally bothered to show up, leaving an elderly, terrified woman entirely alone in the dark for 40 excruciating minutes. She paused briefly to let the weight of that horrifying reality sink into the silent room. She then described how Eleanor had begun losing her hair in large clumps, waking up every morning to find her pillow covered in silver strands, yet absolutely no one on the medical staff had the basic human decency to talk to her about the emotional trauma of losing her dignity. Valerie continued her quiet prosecution, pointing out that absolutely no one ever asked Eleanor how she was actually feeling beyond the sterile parameters of her daily medical chart. Richard immediately went on the defensive, sharply reminding her that he paid exorbitant salaries for 2 highly trained, dedicated nurses specifically assigned to handle all of his mother's medical needs. Valerie calmly acknowledged that the nurses adequately performed their clinical duties, but she profoundly emphasized that sterile medical monitoring and genuine human companionship were 2 vastly different things that could never truly replace one another. She stated that Eleanor did not merely need a professional listening to her blood pressure. She desperately needed a human being to sit with her, hold her hand, and acknowledge her overwhelming fear. Richard stared at her, profoundly struck by her precise, unadorned honesty that completely lacked the defensive insolence typical of an employee caught overstepping their boundaries. Richard rigidly maintained his corporate authority, sternly telling her that despite her emotional justifications, providing companionship was absolutely not her assigned responsibility. Valerie did not flinch, softly but firmly replying that while it was not her job, it was undeniably necessary for another human being's survival. Just before Richard could launch into another reprimand, the heavy office door swung open to reveal Eleanor, sitting weakly in her expensive wheelchair. She was being pushed by a visibly annoyed daytime nurse, who looked as though she desperately wished to be anywhere else on the estate that moment. Eleanor rolled into the center of the spacious office, wearing the unmistakable, fiercely determined expression of a mother who had quietly listened to more than enough of the harsh argument echoing from the marble hallway. Richard stood up immediately, his authoritative demeanor faltering as he asked his mother if she needed immediate medical assistance. Eleanor raised a frail, trembling hand, silencing her powerful son, with a voice that had tragically lost its physical volume to the cancer, but had retained every single ounce of its terrifying maternal authority. She looked Richard directly in the eyes and firmly declared that the young cleaning girl sitting before him was the absolute only person in that massive, empty mansion who had treated her like a living, breathing human being in the past 8 months. When Richard foolishly attempted to bring up the expensive medical team he provided, Eleanor sharply cut him off, angrily forbidding him from mentioning the useless clinical staff ever again. She confessed that her body constantly ached, her hair was falling out, she was paralyzed by terror every single night, and sometimes she just desperately needed someone to sit closely beside her and acknowledge her existence. She took a deep, rattling breath, pointing a shaking finger at Richard, stating that while Valerie actually sat with her in the darkness, he merely sent emails from across the country. The heavy silence that instantly flooded the office carried the crushing, specific gravity of undeniable truths that simply cannot be debated because of their devastating accuracy. Eleanor delivered her final ultimatum, swearing that if Richard foolishly chose to fire Valerie, she would pack her things and leave the estate that very same day. Richard looked at his mother's fiercely determined face, then slowly turned his gaze to Valerie, who remained perfectly silent because the dramatic situation had already articulated everything that needed to be said. Defeated, Richard quietly announced that absolutely no one would be going anywhere, using the tired voice of a man who definitively knows he has lost the argument and wisely chooses not to prolong his total surrender. Eleanor gave a curt nod of approval, gestured for the nurse to turn her wheelchair around, and exited the room, leaving Richard completely alone with the young woman. Valerie stood up to return to her cleaning duties, but Richard stopped her softly, instructing her to continue doing exactly what she had been doing for his mother. That evening, Richard remained locked inside his office with the comprehensive security logs and financial records spread out across the massive desk. He analyzed the detailed documents with the exact same ruthless, microscopic attention he typically reserved for multi-million-dollar corporate acquisitions, scrutinizing every single column, date, and timestamp. According to the official employment contract, Valerie Cross was scheduled strictly from 8 o'clock in the morning until 6 o'clock in the evening, Monday through Friday, with a half-day shift on Saturdays. However, the automated security system that strictly recorded every single entrance and exit through the staff gates revealed a vastly different and highly irregular story. On Tuesday, the 3rd of September, she clocked out perfectly at 6 o'clock, only to silently return to the estate at 11 o'clock at night, possessing no assigned shift and claiming absolutely zero financial compensation for her sudden presence. He continued tracing the digital footprints, discovering that on Thursday the 17th, she possessed no exit record whatsoever, meaning she had voluntarily slept on a spare cot in the mansion without being required to be on duty. On Monday the 24th, she scanned into the property at exactly 6 o'clock in the morning, a full 2 hours before her paid shift officially began. Richard meticulously counted the irregular nocturnal visits, discovering a staggering total of 17 completely unpaid nights over the past 6 months, where Valerie had remained inside the lonely house for absolutely no other reason than her own quiet choice to stay nearby. He then pulled up the minor household expense accounts, locating Valerie's specific log, and was thoroughly confused to find multiple purchases from a small, local neighborhood pharmacy. These were random, inexpensive items that absolutely did not appear on any official prescription list authorized by the highly paid oncologists. He immediately called Mrs. Parker, demanding a thorough explanation regarding the specific pharmacy receipts Valerie had submitted to the estate's accounting department. Mrs. Parker hesitated, her voice tinged with genuine surprise, explaining that those specific items were never actually charged to the household account. Valerie had actively paid for them entirely out of her own meager pocket. The local pharmacist had confirmed that the young woman maintained a personal tab there, stopping by approximately every 2 weeks to purchase supplies on her own dime. Richard hung up the phone, completely stunned by the revelation that a housekeeper earning minimum wage was secretly subsidizing his wealthy mother's absolute comfort. The items were not lavish or terribly expensive, but profoundly thoughtful, a significantly milder painkiller for the rough nights, when the heavy prescriptions caused terrifying hallucinations, organic ginger tea to settle the brutal morning nausea, and strong mint lozenges for when the harsh chemotherapy left a metallic taste in Eleanor's dry mouth. Richard slowly closed the heavy leather folders, pushed his chair back from the desk, and quietly walked out into the vast, dimly lit corridor. The enormous mansion was completely silent at that late hour, the expensive night staff tucked away in their designated quarters, while the ambient security lights cast long shadows across the imported carpets. He walked softly past his mother's grand bedroom and noticed the heavy wooden door was pushed slightly ajar, allowing a warm, incredibly soft glow to spill out onto the marble tiles. He peeked inside and saw Valerie sitting peacefully in the reading chair beside the large medical bed, holding a worn paperback novel and reading aloud in a gentle, rhythmic whisper. Eleanor was fast asleep, but Valerie's soothing voice was perfectly calibrated, low enough not to disturb her delicate rest, yet clear enough that if Eleanor were to suddenly wake in a panic, she would immediately find the comforting sound before the terrifying darkness could consume her. Richard remained frozen in the silent hallway, deeply listening to the gentle cadence of the young woman's voice without daring to step foot inside the sacred room. He did not focus on the actual words of the story being told, but rather on the loving, patient tone of someone who instinctively understood that the rhythm of a human voice matters just as much as its literal meaning. He eventually retreated to his own massive, empty bedroom, sitting heavily on the very edge of his pristine mattress. He thought about his elderly mother, telling him she was deeply proud of the corporate empire he had built, a polite lie covering the sad reality of his constant absence. He thought about his mother's last celebrated birthday exactly 3 years ago and the pathetic string of brief, rushed phone calls he had made from busy international airports to substitute for his actual physical presence. The following morning, Richard walked down to the estate's massive kitchen much earlier than usual, and found Valerie standing quietly at the marble island, diligently preparing his mother's breakfast tray. She briefly glanced up when he entered but completely refused to alter her focused rhythm, continuing to slice fresh fruit into the exact, tiny, manageable portions that Eleanor could safely chew without causing immense pain to her incredibly sensitive mouth. Richard stood awkwardly near the massive refrigerator, clearing his throat before quietly stating that he had completely reviewed the estate's security logs and discovered the unpaid nights and the personal pharmacy receipts. Valerie simply kept her eyes fixed on the wooden cutting board, maintaining her fluid, precise movements, and calmly replied that it was perfectly fine and absolutely nothing to be concerned about. Richard quickly countered, his voice rising slightly, arguing that it was absolutely not fine for a low-wage employee to secretly use her own money to subsidize the basic comfort of a billionaire's household. Valerie finally set the sharp knife down on the counter, wiping her hands on her simple apron, and looked him directly in the eyes with absolute fearlessness. She softly asked if he genuinely wanted her to stop caring for his mother, a profound question that left Richard momentarily speechless and completely disarmed. He quickly recovered, demanding she immediately write down a comprehensive list every single penny she had ever spent, so he could properly reimburse her for her out-of-pocket expenses. Valerie shook her head slightly, stating quite plainly that reimbursement was entirely unnecessary because she had absolutely never performed those acts of kindness expecting a financial reward. Richard softly acknowledged her pure intentions, but stubbornly insisted that he was going to repay the debt regardless of her humble protests. Valerie simply stared at him for a long, heavy moment, gave a tiny nod of concession, and calmly returned to assembling the delicate breakfast tray while Richard poured himself a cup of coffee. For the very first time in decades, Richard did not rush out the door, choosing instead to linger quietly in the kitchen, silently watching Valerie work with a newfound respect. Later that evening, while Valerie was carefully washing the ceramic teacups in the large porcelain sink, Richard asked her how she miraculously knew exactly what people needed long before they ever had the courage to ask for it. Valerie stopped scrubbing, a shadow of old grief briefly passing over her young face, and softly revealed that her own mother had been terribly sick in a very small, cramped house. She explained that when a human being is suffering, they do not need someone to efficiently solve their logistical problems. They desperately need someone to look them in the eyes and simply share the quiet room with them. When Richard gently asked if her mother had recovered, Valerie stared down at the soapy water, her voice breaking slightly as she confessed, Her mother had died of lung cancer exactly 4 years ago because they completely lacked the financial resources for crucial early medical detection. On a brisk Monday morning, Mrs. Parker marched into Richard's office wearing a highly specific, deeply strained expression that Richard immediately recognized from years of managing corporate disasters. It was the distinct look of a seasoned professional delivering highly volatile information that she desperately wished to avoid, but mathematically calculated would be infinitely worse if she attempted to hide it. Mrs. Parker, having flawlessly managed the massive estate for over 12 years, understood that her primary job was to intercept and neutralize problems before they ever reached Richard's desk. She nervously clutched a leather folder tightly against her chest, took a deep breath, and formally announced that there was a critical situation he needed to address immediately. She revealed that Isabella Foster, the sophisticated 34-year-old corporate executive Richard had been casually dating for the past 2 years, had unexpectedly arrived at the estate. Richard's face remained a completely unreadable mask, displaying absolutely no emotion regarding the sudden arrival of the woman who shared his elite social circles, but very little of his actual heart. Their convenient relationship was entirely built on mutual professional benefits, expensive dinner dates, and the comfortable, shallow agreement of two incredibly busy people who simply lacked any urgent reason to break things off. He coldly asked his administrator exactly what the problem was, and Mrs. Parker nervously explained that Isabella had shown up completely unannounced while Richard was sitting upstairs with Eleanor. Instead of waiting patiently in the grand parlor, Isabella had aggressively interrogated the household staff, specifically demanding highly detailed information regarding Valerie's exact employment status, her daily schedule, and her deeply unusual relationship with the family. Isabella had even cornered the daytime nurse, angrily demanding to know why a common cleaning girl was actively sleeping in the mansion 17 nights a month without an assigned shift. Richard found Isabella pacing angrily on the sweeping stone terrace, overlooking the massive manicured gardens, holding an untouched cup of expensive espresso and exuding the aggressive posture of someone preparing for a brutal corporate negotiation. He calmly walked outside, ignoring her hostile glare, and quietly asked why she had chosen to barge into his mother's home completely unannounced, instead of simply calling his private cell phone. Isabella slammed the delicate porcelain cup down onto the wrought iron table, completely ignoring his question, and fiercely demanded to know exactly who the young cleaning girl was and what she was really trying to accomplish. Richard maintained his icy composure, flatly stating that Valerie Cross was a highly valued member of the domestic staff and that she was currently providing essential comfort that his ailing mother desperately needed to survive the brutal treatments. Isabella scoffed loudly, her voice dripping with venomous condescension, asserting that minimum-wage employees absolutely do not sleep in their employer's mansion for 17 unpaid nights simply out of the goodness of their hearts. Isabella coldly evaluated Richard, her sharp eyes narrowing as she utilized the calculating intelligence that made her such a ruthless executive, determined to expose what she perceived as a massive manipulation. She aggressively accused Valerie of intentionally embedding herself into the wealthy family while the boss was away, deliberately generating a toxic emotional dependency within a highly vulnerable dying woman to secure a massive financial payout. Richard stood perfectly still, letting the incredibly ugly accusation hang in the cold morning air, slowly realizing that Isabella's worldview was completely devoid of genuine human empathy. He softly replied that what Valerie was doing actually had a very specific name, one that Isabella was completely incapable of comprehending because it could not be quantified on a balance sheet. He explained that Valerie was simply doing exactly what a loving family member should have been doing from the very beginning, stepping into the massive emotional void that Richard himself had selfishly abandoned. Isabella grabbed her expensive designer handbag, glaring at Richard with absolute disgust, angrily telling him that he was foolishly defending a calculated gold digger while blindly ignoring the blatant truth staring him in the face. She viciously reminded him that Valerie was absolutely nothing more than a contracted maid who had inappropriately decided to occupy incredibly intimate family spaces that absolutely did not belong to her. Richard remained completely silent for a long moment, his mind flooding with vivid memories of Valerie weeping silently while shaving his mother's head and the tragic story of a poor woman dying of lung cancer in a tiny underfunded house. He looked at Isabella, realizing she had visited the sprawling estate exactly 4 times in the past 8 months, and had never managed to spend more than 20 minutes sitting inside Eleanor's room. He finally broke the silence, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register, and firmly declared that Valerie currently occupied the exact space she truly deserved, precisely because absolutely no one else had bothered to show up. Isabella fiercely slung her heavy bag over her shoulder, issuing a final, cold ultimatum, demanding he call her only when he finally decided what was truly important in his life, and stormed off the terrace without waiting for his response. Richard stood completely alone, overlooking the vibrant gardens, utterly shocked to discover he felt absolutely zero regret, missing none of the expected guilt or panic that typically accompanies the abrupt end of a long relationship. Instead, he felt a profound crystal-clear wave of absolute clarity, the uncomfortable but incredibly necessary revelation that occurs when a person finally stops confusing what is socially convenient with what is undeniably true. He turned his back on the empty driveway and walked purposefully back inside the massive house, heading directly upstairs to his mother's quiet bedroom. When he walked through the door, he found Valerie peacefully arranging fresh market flowers in a simple glass vase, while Eleanor watched her with a look of pure, unadulterated serenity. The ultimate turning point of his entire existence arrived completely without warning late on a random Tuesday night while Richard was stubbornly trying to finish reviewing a massive stack of legal contracts in his office. He suddenly heard a terrifying, muffled thud echoing through the ceiling from the floor above, followed by a brief second of dead silence, and then Valerie's voice desperately screaming for the on-call medical team. Richard abandoned his paperwork, sprinting up the grand staircase and bursting into his mother's bedroom in less than 20 seconds, his heart hammering wildly against his ribs. Eleanor was completely collapsed on the hardwood floor beside her expensive medical bed, having foolishly attempted to walk to the bathroom, alone in the dark, only to have her weakened legs completely betray her. She was currently gasping for air with terrifying, wet, ragged sounds, her compromised lungs desperately fighting a losing battle against a massive, sudden buildup of internal fluid. Valerie was already kneeling on the floor beside the dying woman, smartly refusing to move Eleanor's fragile body, knowing full well that amateur handling during a severe crisis could easily shatter her brittle bones or worsen the trauma. With one incredibly steady hand, she cradled Eleanor's silver head, and with the other, she was calmly but firmly demanding the immediate presence of the local emergency physician over the telephone. Richard collapsed to his knees on the opposite side of his mother, completely paralyzed by a profound sense of utter helplessness as Eleanor's terrified, exhausted eyes locked desperately onto his. For the very first time in his entire life, the brilliant corporate strategist had absolutely no plan, no financial leverage, and no quick solution to offer, so he simply reached out, grabbed his mother's frail, trembling hand, and promised her he was not going anywhere. The frantic emergency physician arrived at the Greenwich estate in exactly 8 minutes, largely because Valerie had been incredibly precise and absolutely relentless on the telephone regarding the severe respiratory failure occurring in the bedroom. For the next agonizing hour, Richard refused to leave the crowded room, pinning himself tightly to the corner wall as the highly trained medical team frantically pumped heavy diuretics and supplemental oxygen into Eleanor's failing system. Once the terrifying crisis finally passed and Eleanor was safely stabilized back in her bed, the doctor quietly explained that the massive fluid buildup in her lungs was a stark, undeniable indicator of the rapid decline they had all been dreading. When the medical team finally retreated to the hallway to prepare the remaining intravenous bags, Richard and Valerie were left completely alone in the dim, silent room with the steady, rhythmic hissing of the heavy oxygen concentrator. Richard remained awkwardly rooted beside the massive bed, his large hands nervously fidgeting at his sides, completely unsure of what a son was actually supposed to do once the immediate medical terror had officially subsided. He looked over at Valerie, who was quietly adjusting the room's thermostat to the exact temperature the strict doctor had angrily demanded, moving with the calm, quiet grace of someone completely unfazed by the shadow of death. He softly asked her what he was supposed to do now, a desperate, vulnerable question that completely stripped away his powerful corporate armor and exposed the terrified, deeply insecure boy hiding underneath. Valerie did not mock his profound ignorance, nor did she attempt to offer hollow, meaningless platitudes. She simply pulled a heavy wooden chair right up to the very edge of the mattress. She looked him directly in his tired eyes and softly instructed him to just sit down, gently assuring him that simply being there when his mother finally opened her eyes would be more than enough. Richard obediently sank into the wooden chair, staring blankly at the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of his mother's frail chest beneath the heavy white blankets, utterly terrified that every single breath might miraculously be her last. Valerie quietly switched off the harsh overhead lights, leaving only the soft, amber glow of the small reading lamp on the bedside table, transforming the sterile hospital environment back into a warm, intimate sanctuary. Recognizing that Richard was shivering in his thin dress shirt due to the freezing medical temperatures, she quietly retrieved a thick woolen blanket from the massive closet and gently draped it heavily across his broad shoulders without uttering a single word. She then took her familiar place in the chair on the exact opposite side of the bed, folding her hands quietly in her lap, completely prepared to endure the long, terrifying night watch alongside him. They sat together in absolute silence as the heavy oak clock on the bedroom wall slowly ticked past 1 o'clock, then 2 o'clock, and eventually 3 o'clock in the cold, unforgiving morning. At some point during the agonizing, silent vigil, Richard looked down and was completely shocked to realize that his large hand was tightly holding his mother's incredibly fragile, bone-thin fingers beneath the thick blankets. He truly could not remember making the conscious, deliberate decision to reach out and grab her hand. It had simply happened with the pure, undeniable naturalness of a human body finally surrendering its emotional walls. He slowly lifted his heavy, exhausted eyes and looked across the bed at Valerie, who was still wide awake, watching Eleanor with the incredibly deep, patient attention of someone who had survived countless terrifying nights just like this one. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a harsh, scratchy whisper, and desperately asked Valerie exactly how she had managed to survive this crushing, suffocating nightmare when it was her own mother dying in that tiny house. Valerie remained completely silent for a long, heavy moment, her dark eyes reflecting the soft amber light of the lamp, before brutally and honestly admitting that she had actually handled the entire tragedy incredibly poorly. She confessed that she had been absolutely terrified, completely unguided, and totally overwhelmed by the massive responsibility, but she fiercely maintained that she had absolutely never abandoned her post, remaining completely present until the very bitter end. Richard stared down at his sleeping mother's pale face, tears finally burning the corners of his eyes, and softly confessed to the quiet room that his entire life had been nothing but a pathetic series of cowardly absences. Richard remained at Eleanor's bedside through the night, finally realizing that being present mattered more than any business success he had ever achieved. Encouraged by Valerie's quiet honesty and compassionate guidance, he abandoned his obsession with work, reorganized his responsibilities, and devoted his days to caring for his dying mother. As Eleanor's condition worsened, she found peace in having both Richard's hand and Valerie's comforting presence beside her. Through Valerie, Richard learned the countless small acts of care that no medical report could ever capture, and he gradually understood that empathy and time were far more valuable than wealth or status. Inspired by Valerie's devotion, Richard decided to transform his neglected charitable foundation into an organization focused on providing early cancer screenings for underserved communities. Although Valerie doubted her qualifications, he insisted that her compassion and first-hand experience made her the ideal person to help lead the mission. Before Eleanor passed away, she urged Richard to remain by Valerie's side and never lose the humanity he had rediscovered. After her peaceful death, the newly created Eleanor Foundation launched mobile diagnostic clinics that brought life-saving care directly to disadvantaged neighborhoods, with Valerie designing the program and Richard using his fortune to expand it without hesitation. 1 year later, Richard visited his mother's grave with simple flowers before joining Valerie at the foundation, where Eleanor's memory inspired every project they undertook. Their shared work gradually grew into a deeper personal connection, leading Richard to invite Valerie to dinner, where they spoke not about business but about life, family, and the people who had shaped them. Standing beside her afterward, he realized that true wealth is measured not by money or achievement, but by compassion, presence, and the courage to stand with those we love through life's darkest moments. He understood that genuine fulfillment comes from sharing time, offering kindness, and holding on to one another even when the storms cannot be avoided.